Welcome to Bros Book Club. I am your host, Nerdy Ernie. All around the world, millions of bros gather together for things like sports, drinking, movies, but rarely do we ever get together for things like literature. Here at Bros Book Club, we're aiming to fix that. On this podcast, me and the bros get together to discuss good books, bad books, and maybe even some life-changing books. But mostly, this podcast is just a way for me and the bros to stay connected, share a few laughs and some drinks over the internet, and hopefully inspire more bros to read along and do the same. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Okay. Sweet.
Here we go.
Sorry, George. I startled George. Sorry, Georgie. Daddy's excited.
Georgie.
Hello, nerds. Welcome to Bros Book Club. I'm your host, Nerdy Ernie, here with my co-host, Ryan All Caps. Today is a very special episode.
Very.
We are going to be talking about Jorge Luis Borges. And to quickly introduce this episode, I just wanted to talk about why are we talking about Borges, right? So the first three episodes, we did Leviathan Wakes, we did Project Hail Mary, and then we did A Night of the Seven Kingdoms by George R.R. Martin. Now, those are all, popular books. The first two especially are really just like popcorn entertainment. They're really surface level reads. You don't have to engage with the text too deeply to get enjoyment out of them. They're mostly just meant to be read, enjoyed, and forgotten about, right? I haven't thought about Project Hail Mary since I finished reading it. I haven't thought about Leviathan Wake since I finished reading it. A Night of the Seven Kingdoms is a little bit different. For me, it's a little bit in the middle because it's George R.R. Martin. That's not to say that text is super deep or inaccessible or anything. It's very accessible if you're a Westeros fan. But that being said, it is, everything's on the page. Everything about that story is there on the page. It's there, pretty shallow. Now, when you get to Borges, it's the total opposite end of the spectrum, right? This is a guy who you need to read deeply. There are nuggets of treasure hidden within the text. You can get enjoyment out of him at the shallow level, right? I think he's an entertaining read. Just reading him, not trying to engage too deeply into the text or anything like that. You can get enjoyment out of reading Borges in the same way that you read Leviathan Wakes or Project Hail Mary. But the deeper you dig into him, the more rewarding the reads are. And so back to the original question, why are we reading Borges? When I made this podcast, I wanted this to be selfishly, I just wanted to talk books with my bros, right? It's one thing to talk online with other people who read books, but it's another thing entirely to read books and share these reading experiences with people right? And to share these stories with people And so in a lot of ways, I want to talk about the Leviathan Wakes and the Project Hail Marys with my buds, but I also want to introduce a lot of the bros out there to people like Borges, right? And so who are other writers who fall into this category? I think people like Cormac McCarthy or Gene Wolfe or Toni Morrison or Margaret Atwood fall into this category of these, and Ursula K. Le Guin, I should mention too. These writers who write these really profound literary works, but fall in the same genre as a Leviathan Wakes or a Project Hail Mary. All these authors, except maybe Cormac, write science fiction, fantasy, and even Cormac wrote a post-apocalyptic novel. So there's, people generally who read science fiction or fantasy like dystopia and stuff like that and can get into post-apoc. And so there's even that material on the Cormac end. But these are these writers who, I think can fall into the wheelhouse of these readers who enjoy Leviathan Wakes, Project Hail Mary, these more popcorn entertainment books, and can start to understand what it means to read quote unquote literary works and to read these deeper works of art and these works of literature, and why some people are more posh, right? Like when I read these books, I think of myself as more posh, but I don't know. I don't think of myself as like a posh person. I definitely still get enjoyment out of these popcorn entertainment books, while also like really enjoying people like Borges, people like Cormac McCarthy. And so there's this spectrum that Ryan and I have talked about, in that Leviathan Wakes. I think it's very intentional that we started this podcast with a Leviathan Wakes and are now on episode 4 talking about Jorge Luis Borges. The reason I'm doing that is because I did want to show the spectrum of this podcast. This was like a very deliberate thing. Leviathan Wakes is probably one end of the spectrum, and Borges is the other extreme end of the spectrum in terms of, these are our shallow reads. These are our popcorn entertainment novels. And then Borges and the McCarthys and the Le Guins, these are the people who we're going to spend time on these episodes, probably even have to break them up into multiple parts, because these authors and their works just take so much deliberation and take so much digging. And when you dig with someone else, that's really where a lot of the enjoyment comes in. I think me reading Borges by myself, or Cormac by myself, when I talk with other readers on their interpretations of the text and what they have dug out, it illuminates and fulfills so much more of my missing pieces of my interpretation, missing pieces that I didn't even know were there. And so it creates this further whole that I didn't think was there originally. And it fulfills so much more of my reading experience when it comes to these more literary and deeper authors. And so, yeah, bros and listeners out there, that's why we're talking about Jorge Luis Borges today. And that's why we are making this huge shift from, Leviathan Wakes, Project Hail Mary, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, to Jorge Luis Borges, who I'm willing to bet a lot of people don't even know who he is. So, that being said, Ryan, who is Jorge Luis Borges?
Who is Jorge Luis Borges? That is a hard one to dig into, but we'll try. I'll introduce him just briefly so you guys sort of understand who is this guy that we're even talking about, because I have a feeling that a lot of people, if even a lot of people will listen to this, will not. This will be their first.
All 36 of you out there.
Yeah, all 4, you, me, and our 2 girlfriends. They probably haven't heard of this guy, but he is actually like one of the most fundamental and influential writers for the past century. Jorge Luis Borges, he's Argentinian. He was born in the late 1800s. He died in the 1980s. So he had a pretty long life there. He lived mostly in Argentina. He lived in Spain. He also lived in Switzerland. Was pretty interesting, and he was really fond of that. That's actually where he passed. But he's pretty well traveled, and I think getting exposed to all those cultures had a great definition on his life. He was also a polyglot. He spoke Spanish, English, French, German, Latin. So you can imagine how that influenced his writing and what he was into, because that just opens up worlds to go explore for him and when he was growing up and stuff. An interesting thing about this guy, like eyesight was like a plague for his family. So he grew blind when he was like in his 50s. He was like 55 or something. And the reason he actually ended up in Switzerland when he was younger was because his father also grew blind. And they went to Geneva to get a surgery, and they ended up getting caught there in World War I. And I think that had a lot of impact on his writing and stuff too, just experiencing the war, just the time period he was alive. So that's interesting. And it actually influenced or impacted like his writing. He never stopped creating even after he lost his eyesight. He would like memorize and create poetry and recite it from memory. and have people like write it down for him. So it's pretty cool. A little bit about just his family. I think it's important to bring this up because I think it also impacts him and how he writes, and it influenced him as a person. He has like an ancestry of warriors in his family. It's crazy. So
Interesting.
he can trace his lineage back to literally back to conquistadors when they first came to Latin America.
What?
Yeah,
Holy shit.
insane. He also has a couple like grandparents that were really, there's so many revolutions in South America of different countries becoming independent from Spain and stuff. He had like a couple grandparents or great grandparents or something that were captains and like real battle, bloodthirsty, revered um, soldiers of their time. And they're like captains and corporals or some other like higher ranking people. And also, one of his family names is Isidoro, which when I heard that, I instantly thought this is like the Spanish version of Isildur.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, right?
Wow. Yeah, I didn't catch that till you said that. Wow.
Isildur.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, he's a short story author, novelist, poet. He was just an author's author, like a writer's writer. He wrote everything from essays, translations, literary articles, magazine articles. Um, that was just his thing. Like compared to his family in the past, he found his savagery in writing. Um, yeah, he was super influential in sort of the avant-garde that was brought to Spain and Argentina. They're basically like the first hipsters. And most importantly, and sort of the latest thing is he was hyper influential on the Latin American boom in the 1960s. And if you don't know what that is, that was a boom of like literary genius and superb authors that explored a bunch of different stuff, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Julio Cortázar, Carlos Fuentes, all those guys. Especially Cortázar, you read some of his stuff and you're like, this is looks just like Borges wrote this. It's so close. Um, some other things. I mean, the themes he writes on are like identity, time, culture and language, paradox, reality, religion, allegory, and he was really sort of magical realism before magical realism became the forefront with the Latin American boom. He was sort of the guy behind that.
Mm-hmm. And he loves playing with metafictional aspects as well too.
Yeah, he definitely does. And on top of that, he has this like really there's something about him, I guess it's his personality, where he loves to trick the readers.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely loves to trick the readers. And a funny story on this, when I was doing a little bit of research, he, I forget which story it was, but he wrote a story, and in that story, he had like a fictional piece of work, and he was saying there are like different volumes of this, and they're like new editions that were coming out, and he'd put in footnotes so it looked like he cited this from a source and all this stuff. And he had a guy who was his friend. He was like a writing buddy who was also an author. And back in the day, you would have like a book guy that would go. You would tell them what titles you wanted. You would request a title. They'd go get it. You'd pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And his friend, Borges's friend, requested from his book guy to go get this fictional book from actually
Oh
requested.
my gosh.
Yeah, actually requested to go get this fictional book that he made, and obviously he didn't get it because it's not a
That's
real book.
hilarious.
But he has this like matter of factness, and that sort of ties to how when I was first introduced to him, what I loved about it. I'd never read an author where it was fiction, but it was so matter of fact that I had to put the book down and Google multiple times through the book to verify that this isn't fiction. Like, did
Mhm.
this actually happen? And so that, for me, when I first found him, that is really what drove sort of why I liked him, my curiosity about him. And honestly, he in my mind, he's like this mythical sort of creator and author, and my favorite author.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So
little,
to
yep.
a couple things on that that I wanted to speak to. First off, the thing that you said about him being a writer's writer, that is an understatement. He is like, he lives in the pantheon of the writing gods, I think. And if there are writing gods out there in a literary pantheon, he would be Zeus, I think. In my opinion. And what led me to him was Gene Wolfe, who I have discovered within the last year, and I think is probably my favorite author. And I only say that by default because Gene Wolfe wrote novels, and I just love novels, right? Like I love the experience of diving into these longer works and these huge worlds. And so that I think is what's funny though, is that I don't think Borges was capable of writing a novel because he not in the fact that like, oh no, he wasn't good enough to write a novel. It's just that he was so perfect and succinct with his word choices that any novel that he would probably write would be like 80 pages or like 90 pages or something like that, because it's just, he says so much in with so few words. Whereas the funny part about that is Gene Wolfe is like the opposite. He writes like really long novels. I shouldn't say that. He has written short novels, but he loves to go on with his sentences. We'll say that. He's pretty purple with his prose, but in a really, really good way. But anyway, what led me to Borges was Gene Wolfe, after I started just, looking up Gene Wolfe influences and things like that, like what made Wolfe Wolfe. And one of the sentences that struck me with Gene Wolfe was he said that he bowed to no one in his regard of Jorge Luis Borges. And when I read that sentence, I remember you telling me about him, and I had heard the name Jorge Luis Borges, but I had never read anything by him. I just knew he was like this mythic author. And what's funny is I do read short stories, so you would think like I should pick this guy up. This guy's like the master of the short story.
You also write short stories.
Exactly. Yeah. Being a writer myself, that's why I'm so gravitated towards people like Gene Wolfe, because he also, I think, is a writer's writer. There's so much that you can learn from people like Gene Wolfe.
Yeah.
And so I was like, you know what? Let's go back to the source. Let's see the influences on Gene Wolfe. And then I read Library of Babel, and yeah, my whole world changed. My whole universe changed. There are two authors who have done that for me. One was Cormac McCarthy. For me, there's before Cormac and after Cormac. There's BC and AC. And before Cormac, I remember thinking books are really cool. They're really fun. They're like a higher form of movies to me. Like movies are things to just like get away and have cathartic experiences. Books are like a longer form of that, so they're more meditative to me. But then after Cormac, I realized, oh my God, books can be as impactful as music, as paintings. They can be like sculptures. This is what art is, right?
Wow.
Like that's, Cormac made me realize literature really is a capital A art form.
Wow.
And then Borges, then there was before Borges, and then there was after Borges. And really what before Borges was me thinking, oh, I can do this. I feel like I can be a writer. And then after Borges was, no, I could never be a writer like this. He is quite simply one of those writers who ruins you, right? He is the pinnacle of writing. He is the mountaintop of what it means to be like creating these forms of art. He is our like Picasso, right?
Yeah.
He's just, the things that he wrote can't be topped, in my opinion. You can try and emulate and be like Borges, but you will never be Borges. And yeah, anyway.
And it's a little note on, because you mentioned like poshness, and there is a sort of like, I don't know what it is. It's like poshness, but sort of like persnickety. When you talk about Borges, you're like
Yeah.
super like hipster, like super,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And a funny story on this, when I first heard about him, I was like studying Spanish in college, and I wanted to read, and someone, I think one of the teachers was like, you should read Borges. And at the time, I was learning Spanish and I didn't necessarily know how to pronounce his name. And I went to the library at our university and I was like, could you I'm trying to find an author. And she was like, yeah, who are you looking for? And I was like, Jorge Luis Borges. And she stopped everything she was doing and she looked at me and she was like, Borges? And yeah, I was like, yeah, that's who I'm. But that he has that like I don't know, like demands that aura, or like people have just
Yeah.
created that aura about him
Well,
from
okay,
his
so
works.
that's a good point. I'm glad that you brought that up because I back to what I was saying to introduce the episode. I think that like this is a problem that persists in readers, right? Like there's readers who look down on other readers, and it goes both ways. Like there's the people who read, for instance, like The Witchers or something like that, or whatever. Like let me just like look at my bookcase real quick. Oh, okay, like Hugh Howey. Like they read like Wool, who falls in the same category, I think, as someone like Leviathan Wakes or Project Hail Mary, which we've reviewed. And they look at people who read Borges or Cormac McCarthy or Gene Wolfe, and they're like, oh my God, they're the posh readers.
Yeah.
They're the people who look down on us. So we like look at them a certain way. And then it goes the other way. There's the people who read Nabokov or Thomas Proust and who look down on people who just read genre, right?
Yeah.
They look down on people who aren't reading these like literary masterworks. They think that reading Project Hail Mary is a waste of time.
Yeah.
When in reality, the point of this podcast is to introduce the concept that you can be both.
Yeah.
You know, like you can enjoy Project Hail Mary and Leviathan Wakes, but you can also enjoy Jorge Luis Borges. And to me, the thing that I compare him to, at least my reading experience thus far with Borges, is he, to me, is like the Christopher Nolan of literature. He's obviously, I think he's an even higher level than Nolan is in film and avant-garde and things like that. But Christopher Nolan strikes that balance, right? Where he is really entertaining to the masses, but he really has some like highly elevated pieces of art out there with like things like Memento and Inception and things like that. And Interstellar, you know,
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think a good way to say it is that Christopher Nolan could make some really good adaptations of some Borges short stories.
And I think he's the only one
who
could do something with Borges.
100%.
But yeah, to the point I was making, that's what I want this podcast to be. I want this to be like the bridge between like the mass appeal of genre works, but also introduce some more literary works on this podcast and be like, guys, like there's cool shit on both sides.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we are throwing ourselves in the deep end with Borges. But what I like about Borges is that he has science fictional and fantastical elements. Like there's a lot of crossover with genre readers for Borges in particular. He's not someone who's just purely literature. Like he's not writing about the American or Latin American experience or like a family tale or whatever. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but this dude is writing sci-fi, like straight up sci-fi and straight up fantasy. And people who read sci-fi and fantasy and just like genre work, I think will enjoy a Borges short story.
Yes. It could almost be like like some of these short stories could be excerpts from a bigger world that someone would be a fan of sci-fi in, but even on their own, they're so cool to dig into. And for me, it takes multiple reads that really get it. But like he touches on so many. He was literally magical realism before that happened with the Latin America
Yes.
boom. And yeah, it's like literary sci-fi or literary
Yes.
fantasy. That's what he
Yes.
wrote.
Yes. So to talk about that real quick. So one thing about Gene Wolfe in particular that drives me to him is he falls in that same category as Borges, where he writes very literary sci fantasy. It's not even one or the other. He doesn't really write science fiction or fantasy in particular. He has novels that fit squarely in both, but his masterpiece, The Book of the New Sun, is straight up sci fantasy. Right? It's like a marriage of the two. And so one issue with Gene Wolfe becoming like very, very popular with the masses is that he was very hard to define, right? He was literary, but he was also a genre writer, and the genres he was writing in didn't fall squarely into one or the other. It was kind of both. So Gene Wolfe, not to say that Gene Wolfe is like underrated or like not as widely read as he should. Well, he is. I don't think he is as widely read as he should be, but he's not as famous, I should say, or well known as some of these other writers out there because of, things like this. And so he falls in that same category as Borges. And that's why I think it's important for people like me and you who have, friends who read the other end of the spectrum, the popcorn books.
Yeah.
And introduce them to people like Borges and Wolfe and be like, dude, the only reason you don't know about him is because, yes, he's literary, but because he's also writing in this like weird little nook that people don't look, right? Like
the nook where you don't look.
Yeah, in this nook, people don't look. But it's literally because people who like shy away from literary works, they automatically go, no, I don't want to read Borges. He's
too
posh for me.
Yeah,
he's
too posh.
Yeah, he's too dense. He's too hipster. I like genre. But by you saying that, you are admitting that you would like Borges and you would like Wolfe.
Yeah. Yes. It's a paradox. Much like
right.
what Borges writes.
I know. That's like spot on. He's so meta. Anyway.
He's so meta, man. One of his names should be Meta.
Meta Borges.
Meta Borges.
That sounds like his, if you uploaded his brain into a Decepticon.
Yeah.
It's Meta Borges.
It's Meta Borges.
Anyway, one final note that I wanted to speak on about him to make this meta as well. I think you and I are extremely lucky that Borges was a polyglot and that he wrote in Spanish and English primarily. Also from the fact that, in my opinion, I think Spanish translates to English very well. There's obviously, like all translation, there's some nuances. But I think for the most part, when you compare it to, I don't know, Mandarin to English or Russian to English, Spanish, I think is easier to translate to English. And I might be upsetting people out there, but I think that's fair to say. What do you think about that as someone who's, English was your primary language and English was my primary language growing up as well. But I also grew up in a Spanish speaking household. So I think my opinion is maybe a little bit colored differently than that. What do you think on that?
I think, I mean, the ultimate experience is probably to read Borges in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. You maybe lose 90% of sort of some of the magic that the Spanish language brings when you translate. You keep about 90%. You don't lose that much. So you're right. I think you're right on that part, and a lot of that has to do with just Latin being sort of the foundation for both languages. I think it translates well.
Right.
You're right.
Yeah. English is a very Germanic and Latin based language.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, translating from Spanish to English, I think we're incredibly lucky that we get his short stories in English, because it makes me think about, like, when I thought about me reading the Library of Babel in English, I felt that way. I felt very lucky that I am able to be exposed to someone like this who wrote in Spanish and English, because I remember reading Reddit posts on The Witcher when the show was first coming out, and people recommending the books and whatnot. And I've read the books, and I really like the Witcher books, but I definitely consider them in the other end of the spectrum, the popcorn genre
side.
reads. Yeah, maybe not as extreme as something like Leviathan Wakes or Project Hail Mary, but it was definitely just a book that, to me, it required a very shallow read. I didn't think about it too much after I was done. I did think about it after, just because it was good. It was just so good that I really enjoyed it. And so it stayed in my mind for a while, but it wasn't like deeply impacting to me as like a Cormac McCarthy or a Borges is. But if you go on Reddit and you read from Polish readers out there, where the language was that The Witcher was originally written in, they actually consider The Witcher their Lord of the Rings.
Whoa.
They consider Andrzej Sapkowski their Tolkien.
Really?
In their language, the Witchers are considered these like very literary pieces of art. And so knowing that is what made me so grateful to be able to read someone like Borges and understand that in the translation, I kept so much of the literary masterwork involved in him writing it. Whereas if, he wrote in another language that, like Icelandic or something, that's like really hard to translate.
Or even French or German, which were two languages that he knew and was comfortable with.
Right, exactly. So, I imagine like all it took was, me being lucky enough to know the two languages that he primarily wrote in. To be and being that lucky to read Borges. I think everybody who is that blessed should read him, honestly.
Agreed.
Because there are instances out there where, there's pieces of literature out there that are just amazing, but we will never be able to like fully appreciate because they don't translate that well to our primary language.
Like it's such a big ask, and he was a renowned translator. Like he translated so much stuff. Like everybody knew he translated volumes and volumes of like text. And I don't know who translated this, Andrew Hurley. I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't know who that guy is, but that's sort of like asking someone to fill Michael Jordan's shoes, I feel like. So, but I think he did a good job.
Yeah, I agree.
I think he did a good job, because it doesn't seem like you lose any of the magic from the Spanish version, whatever that would be. I haven't read Borges in Spanish, but
so I did. I read, because I was interested in this. I was wondering how he translated him, and I read some of the Library of Babel in Spanish. I read like one or two paragraphs. I didn't read the whole thing. But for the most part, I don't want to say it was easy or anything, but he was very faithful to the original text.
That's good to know.
It wasn't like just like a word for word translation, obviously, because there's idioms that you have to. But yeah, from what I read in Spanish, it was, like I said, it was very, very faithful to like the original syntax and word choices that Jorge Luis Borges wrote in. Because the reason I say we're lucky is because a lot of those words in Spanish do have English counterparts. Whereas in other languages, there's just certain words in English that we don't have in other languages. Whereas in Spanish, I think we pretty much cover both dictionaries very, very well.
Yeah, there's overlap for sure.
Tons of overlap. Yeah.
The English world and the Spanish world bleed together just because of how the world is, that I think there's enough like through history that it just overlapped. And what you're saying is exactly spot on. Like we're lucky
Yeah.
to land in one of those two buckets.
For sure. Honestly, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I remember I explicitly wanted to state that gratitude because I genuinely do think that just being able to read in English, I feel like you should give Borges a try, just from the simple fact that, we are lucky enough to be able to read someone of that caliber from another country.
Yeah. Well,
in our language.
You heard it here first on the Bros Book Club podcast. If you speak English and read English, you have to read Borges.
Should be required reading.
Required reading.
Oh, I wanted to ask about that. When did you hear first about, you said in college, right?
Yeah, I was in college. It was one of my Spanish classes. I'm pretty sure I went and asked one of the teachers, just like, hey, I want to read some Spanish. Who should I go for?
That's interesting that you had to ask for a Spanish-speaking author, because I wonder if he should be in more like curriculums.
Yeah.
As part of just like, I don't know, like high school, honestly.
Honestly, some of these short stories I feel like would do a great service to just expose people to what a thought experiment is.
Yes.
And like just really break down a 3-page short story that can be super dense, but it's a mega thought experiment and really forces you to like open your mind, put yourself in this person's shoes that's writing it, and he brings so many different themes and ideas into each one of these short stories. Like it should be, and I know it is for, I'm sure, in different universities and like higher level education. I know for a fact he gets studied, but like introducing that earlier on, I think it would be great.
Yeah. Okay. So I think about my high school curriculum, and I think that feeds into the current context of us being in the situation where there's a divide between readers that look down on each other, right? Because I think in a lot of ways it does start from high school, where you get your honors English students and your AP English students who are studying these really literary pieces of literature, as opposed to readers who just read for fun, and they might be reading comics, graphic novels, sci-fi, fantasy, mystery, true crime novels that aren't really read in the high school setting. And so you're already creating this divide between people who are like studying books as opposed to people who are enjoying books. Yeah. And I think that's one of the big fallacies of learning or just creating a well-read student body. I think high school should not, like, we shouldn't be so focused on the Great Gatsbys and the Catchers in the Rye,
Animal Farm,
right?
Lord of the
Animal
Flies.
Farm and things like that. I think that they are great books to study, and they have a lot of merit on their own, definitely. But I think back on when I was 15, 16 years old, like I wasn't ready to appreciate those books in the way that I do now.
Yeah.
Even Hemingway, like I remember even in high school, I loved Hemingway. I like, that was one of the first authors that I got him right away. I was like, man, I get what he's trying to do and I really like him. But, you know, I've reread him over the years and I'm like, how did I get him in high school? Like, no, I didn't get Hemingway in high school. Like I think as you age, you understand these texts so much more. And so like, I get exposing, you know, high school students to these pieces of literature and just to teach them to like engage with text. But I think in order to get there, I think the bigger focus should be on creating a love of books and a love of reading. And so a big part of that is finding what genre you like. Like, do you like science fiction? Do you like fantasy? Do you like mystery? Do you like romance? Do you like true crime? Like, there's just so much out there. And I think specifically like freshman and sophomore year, we should spend way more time on like just exposing us to a wide array of different books, and not even like dense books that you have to like engage with, just enjoyable books that like make you proud of having read them and make you want to read another book. Right. And so once you get into the habit or once you get a student to love reading, then you hit them with The Great Gatsby. Then you hit them with The Catcher in the Rye and be like, hey, check this book out and go a little deeper with your read on this one. Right. Don't just like you're going to enjoy this book, but like come at me with an essay on this or whatever. And then you create a love of reading at that point. And yeah,
you should be a teacher.
No, because then I would just be teaching Borges and Gene Wolfe.
Yeah, you would, and you would get fired.
I would be preparing them for the SAT, basically. I'd just be like, yo, let's read the book of the new sun.
I feel like there would be an overlap, though, between people reading Harry Potter and people that would enjoy the Library of Babel, though.
Yes.
100%. I really think there would be.
Yeah. And again, this goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. I think that's ultimately the purpose of this episode in particular and the podcast as a whole. It's illuminating the fact that statement is true, that the Harry Potter reader and the Jorge Luis Borges reader are not two different people. Yeah. They are the same person in my eyes.
Yes. So meta. That is Meta Borges.
Meta Borges! Oh no, he strikes again!
Meta Borges strikes again.
Okay, one last thing before we dive into Library of Babel. I wanted to ask you something because I was thinking about this before we hopped on here. To you, and I'm speaking to like reading in general, because I think that there's a divide between readers who think this. In your opinion, can you separate between what you think is objectively best and what is subjectively your favorite? So, for example, I believe, or I shouldn't say I believe, I know that episode 5 of Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, is the best Star Wars movie out there. Now, I say that while also knowing or believing that episode 6, Return of the Jedi, is my personal favorite, right? Like I know episode 5 is the best, but my favorite of the Star Wars movies is episode 6, Return of the Jedi. So my question to you is, do you believe that is possible, or do you think that the best has to be your favorite because in order for something to be your favorite, it has to be the best?
No, I'm with you. I'm on that team. Like, you can recognize the greats and understand, like, objectively, like, there's a way to measure sort of for works of art like this, that it's like, this is the best thing that has ever been written.
Mm-hmm.
And is what it is. It's probably not going to be my favorite because it comes down to art is very subjective. It is subjective in essence. And my favorite is not going to be the best work of art.
Right.
Period. It just won't be. I'm trying to think of something that I really like that is like.
So for you, I want you to talk about music because you're very well versed in music. You went to music school. You're a musician yourself. Check out Ryan Cap's music on YouTube. Sweet Tooth. It's his best song. I'm going to make him play it at my wedding.
I would love to.
So, yeah. So like, in your opinion, what is your favorite piece of music versus what you think is the best piece of music?
That's such a tough question because,
Let's go
well,
Black Keys. What is the
yeah,
best Black Keys song versus your favorite Black Keys song?
objectively, the best Black Keys album is
Okay.
Brothers.
Okay.
Outside of like the awards it won, but from start to finish, it's like you can listen to it in its entirety. You don't skip anything.
Mm-hmm.
You every song is standalone in itself, amazing, and the creative genius in each one of the songs is apparent, and it's there. Objectively, the best.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Subjectively, my favorite is their first album.
Okay. Now, why is that?
It is very, very raw. It is very. They recorded it basically in a basement with an 8-track recorder.
Mm-hmm.
Him, Pat Carney, and Dan Auerbach. So you can imagine. So like with Brothers, they had a lot of production, multiple tracks, recording. They had a lot of production on it. With that one, it's very raw, low production. The songs are basically just like blues, garage, rock songs. Subjectively, that's my favorite. I put that on. It's my favorite vinyl record that I have. I put that on. I jam out. I love it.
Love it. Okay.
Love it.
So, since you are a subscriber of this school of thought,
Yes.
do you find that in your life that is a repeating pattern? That in everything that you enjoy, do you find that there is something that you objectively think is the best versus what you subjectively think is your favorite? Things that are more personal to you versus things that you like recognize as like those are the best.
Yeah, I mean, even in movies, like really one of my all-time favorite movies is A Knight's Tale.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that movie. Or You and Me Both, Forgetting Sarah Marshall. That has
Yes.
like sentimental value to both of us for some reason,
Yeah.
some weird reason. And obviously, that's not the best movie
Right.
ever made.
Right.
Like spot
There.
on.
Yeah.
It's a recurring theme in my life for sure.
Right. Objectively, the best comedy ever is Dumb and Dumber.
Hey, hey,
No, I'm kidding.
hot take.
I'm kidding. But yes, okay. So I agree with you, and it's the same in my life, where in a lot of like the things that I enjoy and like different art forms, I find that as like a repeating pattern for me. There's always like the thing that I objectively know and recognize is the best, but there's always something that's more personal to me. There's always the thing that is subjectively to me my favorite above the thing that I know is the best. The reason that I said all that and we went on this huge long side tangent is because in this very rare instant, The Library of Babel, the first short story that I ever read by Jorge Luis Borges, is the marriage of those two. And it's the first time that I've ever found that I think is the best objective short story I've ever read is also my subjectively favorite short story I've ever read.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
So with that, let's dive into The Library of Babel.
Let's go. I can't wait.
Okay, so The Library of Babel. The reason we chose this short story to talk about Jorge Luis Borges, it was just the first short story that I read by Borges. But like I was saying, I like sincerely think this is probably the best short story ever written, and it is my personal favorite of Jorge Luis Borges, or any short story. What is your opinion on this short story?
Oh, on the short story?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if it's my favorite, man. I know what my favorite short story is. It's Isle of the Cyclades by Julio Cortázar. But you read that and you see he's one of the guys that was in the Latin American boom, and you see all the Borges influences. So it's almost like my favorite short story is still a Borges short story. Um, but my opinion of Library of Babel, I like it. Number one. Number two, I think this might have been one of his favorites
Mm,
because of just the number of themes and things that he brought into this, like culture and like history. It's like a world building thing. It's almost like a creationist story.
yeah.
There's like languages, and it's like the world he would want to live in,
Mm,
being
interesting.
being like an author's author. That's my
Oh,
opinion of this.
interesting. Okay. Okay, let's get into it. So, listeners out there, I want to give a quick note on how we're going to handle spoilers for this episode. When we're talking about Borges short stories, they're like 3 to 7 pages long. So, spoilers are pretty much like a necessity to talk about them.
Just go read it.
Yeah, it's really hard to be vague about Borges or a Borges short story. And so, as a necessity to talk about these short stories, we are going to go into full-on spoilers. Now, that being said, in my opinion, I don't think knowing the spoilers of a Borges short story ruins the experience of reading him. I think it's a totally different thing knowing the spoilers of Interstellar before watching the movie, as opposed to knowing the spoilers of a Borges short story and then reading that Borges short story. Because I feel like you can know everything going in ahead of time, but nothing will prepare you for the language that Borges uses and just like the trance that you fall in reading a Borges short story. Because it really is, in my opinion, a trance, right? Like because he's so succinct with his language and says so much with so few words that it really feels like you are just like falling in this pit of literary greatness. And so I can tell you all I want about the Library of Babel, but nothing will like replace the experience of you actually reading it. So, that being said, full spoilers ahead. Warning. Spoilers ahead. We're just going to go dive head first into this short story. Okay, so the Library of Babel is about a man who lives in a universe known as the library. Now, what is the library? The library is composed of an indefinite, perhaps infinite number of hexagonal galleries, right? So the whole universe is a library, and the library is divided into these hexagonal galleries, and each hexagon has bookshelves lining all of its walls. I shouldn't say all of its walls. 4 of every 6 walls on the hexagon has exactly 5 bookshelves. And on these 5 bookshelves holds exactly 32 books. And in these 32 books, there are exactly 410 pages, every single book. And each page contains exactly 40 lines, and each line contains approximately 80 black letters. And that is a repeating pattern through every single bookshelf, on every single wall, in every single hexagonal gallery. Now, like I was saying before, in each hexagon, only 4 of the 6 hexagonal walls has these bookshelves. On 2 of the walls opens up into these, what he calls vestibules. And basically, in these 2 openings, these 2 vestibules, there's room for the librarians, the inhabitants of this universe, to sleep upright, and also to take care of their physical necessities, such as, going to the bathroom. And then furthermore, there is also a spiral staircase that takes you infinitely upward and infinitely downward to more levels in the library. Now, if you go simply right or left, there's just going to be more hexagons infinitely to the right, infinitely to the left. And so the library, this universe, is allegedly infinite, right? Like that is kind of that's really what this short story is going to go into. Now I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So let's talk about the protagonist. Who is the protagonist of this short story? The protagonist is this unnamed older librarian who is losing his vision, and he is preparing for his own death. And I'm going to read something straight from the short story. Like all men of the library, in my younger days I traveled. I have journeyed in quest of a book, perhaps the catalog of catalogs. Now that my eyes can hardly make out what I myself have written, I am preparing to die, a few leagues from the hexagon where I was born. When I am dead, compassionate hands will throw me over the railing. My tomb will be the unfathomable air. My body will sink for ages and will decay and dissolve in the wind engendered by my fall, which shall be infinite. So, in the center of these hexagons is a ventilation shaft, and it's bounded by a low railing, as Borges relates. So, when the librarians die in this universe, they are hurled over the railing and into the ventilation shaft, where that is your burial, in essence. You literally just fall for eternity, and you wither away into a skeleton and to dust as you just fall infinitely.
That's so crazy. I put the book down and thought about that when I read
it's gnarly. But I anyway, that's just like a cool thing to point out. But I want to point out what the protagonist says early on. Like all men of the library, in my younger days I traveled. I have journeyed in quest of a book, perhaps the catalog of catalogs. And I think Borges does something here that is just very, very subtle, but he makes us relate to him. This is almost like a universal thing, right? Like we are, in a lot of ways, we're all librarians just looking for our book. We're looking for our catalog of catalogs. No one outright says it, right? Like I don't travel to find the meaning of life. I don't, do the things that I do to find the meaning of life. But in a lot of ways, I think subconsciously we all are, right? Like we meet other people and we travel to different places and we read all these different books to find meaning, right?
Yeah.
Like we, on a subconscious level, we are all journeying in quest of our book to perhaps find the catalog of catalogs.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, Ryan?
That's 100% one of my coming away from the short story. It's like, what is this about? And most of his short stories, you're going to do that. And this one, that was one of the questions, was like, is this about the meaning of life? Is this sort of the quest of all knowledge? Or is this the quest to find our catalog of catalogs?
Mm-hmm.
The quest to find later in it, they talk about the book of vindication, which I guess sort of tells you your death or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think this is his way to write about this thing that we all do.
Mm.
We all are sort of like searching for the meaning of life. Like, why are we here? What are we doing? And it just happens to be, he writes it in the form of a book. Our catalog of catalogs.
Very metaphorical, right? Like I agree with that. He's basically saying the metaphor here is that our world is like a library and we are all librarians just searching for that book that like tells us our meaning.
Yep.
And yeah, it's a very, like I was saying before, that one sentence is so subtle because it, in a lot of ways, subconsciously is making you relate to the protagonist, who's this unnamed librarian, but it's completely universal in my opinion. I think that this protagonist is like universally relatable to anybody reading this short story.
Yeah.
So me reading that, I'm just like, God, Borges, you're a master, dude.
You cheeky little devil.
You cheeky little devil.
Little devil.
So anyway, so what is the plot of this short story? And so in order to answer that question, basically there are two overarching mysteries in the universe that our protagonist relates. The two mysteries are whether the library is truly infinite or is it finite, and whether the letters within these books have any meaning, or if they really are just a random assortment of letters made by an indifferent construction by the god of this universe.
Yeah.
Right. And the protagonist early on, I think it's page 2. He basically relates that he claims that he has solved these mysteries. But before he reveals this discovery, he recounts more details and history about the library to provide context about his discovery. And I'll quickly read a little quote from the short story. There are also letters on the front cover of each book. Those letters neither indicate nor prefigure what the pages inside will say. I am aware that lack of correspondence once struck men as mysterious. Before summarizing the solution of the mystery, whose discovery, in spite of its tragic consequences, is perhaps the most important event in all history, I wish to recall a few axioms. So basically, he's about to tell you what he has discovered about the mysteries of this universe. But before he does so, he has to provide more context about the library itself and the histories of the library. And so about the next 3 or 4 pages, they are his axioms, basically, before he talks about his actual discovery. And so the thick of the short story is him just literally relating the histories about the libraries and the different cultures of the libraries, right? Which there are.
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So to further contextualize the library, there are some truths that he relates. One is that the library has existed, quote unquote, ab aeternitate, which means that it also confirms its future eternity. So in other words, he's saying the library has always existed and it always will exist.
Yeah.
The other truth about the library is that there are 25 orthographic symbols, meaning there's 25 letters, right? There's 25. That also includes punctuation. So there's also the comma, the period, and I think there's something else I can't remember. But basically, there's 3 forms of punctuation and letters, right? And within those letters, that is the constraints of every single book within the library. There are only 25 orthographic symbols, no more, no less. So a book can only be comprised of that alphabet of 25 symbols. Now, that being said, when you look at when you pluck a random book off the shelf within this hexagonal library, more often than not, 99% of these books are going to be just total nonsense. They're going to be either one symbol or letter repeated nonstop for 410 pages, or they will just be complete babble. And I'm gonna to speak on that. I'm gonna pluck one quote from the short story real quick. For every rational line or forthright statement, there are leagues of senseless cacophony, verbal nonsense, and incoherency. So basically, what he's saying that within this nonsense, you will occasionally get one line of something that makes sense, right? So within something that just says blah, 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 there will be one sentence in this 410 page book that says something, and it could be random. It could just be a random assortment of words, or it could actually mean something. Right. So that's where it comes in, where he says, for every rational line or forthright statement, there are leagues of senseless cacophony, verbal nonsense, and incoherency. Now, so because of that, there are branching and dividing schools of thought within the library surrounding that. Some people believe that you can find meaning in the books, right? You can actually hunt down some books that have things that make sense and things that you can take from the book that, actually makes sense.
It's written in code.
Right.
It's like a code. Yeah.
On the other side of that, others believe that it's stupid to think that you can gather meaning from these books. And they think it's the equivalent of finding meaning in dreams or the lines on one's hands, right?
Yeah.
Like it's stupid to occasionally come upon a sentence that actually makes sense and think that you're gathering meaning from it. Others believe that these nonsense books are simply in ancient or far distant languages. So, in other words, none of the books are nonsense. They're actually all have meaning in them. We just can't understand them and we can't interpret them. That also further indicates that there are different languages within this universe. It's not just the one language that he is relating to this. There's Portuguese, there's Spanish, there's German, there's every single language conceivable with these 25 orthographic symbols. And I'll take one line from the short story. It is true that the most ancient peoples, the first librarians, employed language quite different from the one we speak today. It is true that a few miles to the right, our language devolves into dialect, and that 90 floors above, it becomes incomprehensible. So, where this current protagonist is situated within the library, if he goes 90 miles to the right, they speak the same language, but it becomes a different dialect. It's like if you ran into Jamaicans or something like that who speak English, but they speak a very different kind of English from us. And then if he goes 90 miles up the spiral staircase, they're speaking Spanish. They're speaking German or French or whatever, right? They're speaking something that is incomprehensible to an English speaker. So that provides all kinds of crazy context to the library. Now, the last fact that he also relates, I shouldn't say the last one, but the last implication that comes from that is that no two books are identical within the library. Now, that being said, that means that the library is quote unquote total, meaning all possible combinations of the letters will express every single possible permutation in every possible language, which further indicates that the library is actually finite. So, yeah, stick with me here. Stick with me here, listeners. We're going down the library Babel rabbit hole, right? So, some people think that the library is infinite, but some people go way down this rabbit hole and believe that it is actually finite. It's just unfathomably large, but it is finite because while you taking every single possible combination of 25 letters in every single language, if you take every single permutation, that number is unfathomably huge, but it is a number. And it is not infinity. So because of that, librarians went out seeking books that describe their life, right? Like philosophically speaking, that means that if there is every single permutation of every single combination of every letter in every language, that means that there is a book out there that describes your life perfectly.
Yeah.
You just have to find it.
Your book of vindication.
Yes, exactly. On the flip side, that also means that there is a book out there that describes what your life could have been like had you made a different choice. And every single choice you've ever made in your life. That, furthermore, stick with me here, listeners. That also means that there is a book out there that tells you every single lie in your life. It's almost like your anti-life. It gets every single thing wrong about your life. It describes you perfectly, but in sort of an antithetical kind of way, right? Like there is the book of vindication, but then there is also the book that is like the complete opposite of that book. And do you want to go?
This is where you can say that Borges writes and it's like subtle. It's not in your face, sort of like sci-fi or fantasy. But where he writes literary sci-fi or fantasy, he's talking about multi dimensions
Yes.
and multi-dimensional realities through the medium just happens to be books and this Library of Babel. And it also supports the fact that what we said about Christopher Nolan being the one that could adapt. I feel like he's the only one that could adapt this multi-dimensional reality of your life. I also interpreted when I read this. Tell me if you are on the same page. No pun intended.
Nice.
Do you like that one?
Yeah.
Okay. About it would also the library would also entail like every permutation of every book every written. So like Tolkien, like
Yes.
it would have his entire series, but then at the end Frodo doesn't throw the ring in. Spoilers.
Yes.
Right?
But
Okay.
but so here's the next piece of context that is important to relate, right? So for every time that you find Tolkien's Lord of the Rings in the library, you have to go through just an endless sea of nonsense. Because think about it. If you find the Lord of the Rings, if you are just like astronomically lucky to find that book, there is also a chance and a higher likelihood that you will find the Lord of the Rings with typos in it. That you will find the Lord of the Rings half written. Right? Like the chances of you actually finding a book that is from front to back completely coherent is astronomically small.
It's so small.
And then, like you were saying before, like the Book of Vindication, the chances of you yourself finding the book that relates your life and your death is even further astronomically small. And so,
oh my gosh.
Yeah,
mind blown.
I know, yeah. Stick with me here, listeners. Stick with me here. You're just like you're going further and further and further down this like math problem is what it becomes at the end of the day.
Probability.
Right?
It's a probability.
Yes, if we're not talking about infinity, but we're talking about this unfathomably large number, it almost becomes infinitely impossible to find these books that these librarians seek.
Because what's the difference? If say so, if it's infinity, you're never going to get to the end of it anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And if it is finite technically, but it's just so vast and large and long, and the zero is so many spots past the decimal point, it's the same thing. In your lifetime, you're never going to get there.
Yes.
Or in generations, you're never going to get there.
And then there's also this, right? So let's say on the off chance, the astronomically low chance that you actually find the book that relates your life and your death, do you trust it at that point? Or is that one of the permutations of your life that is wrong, right? So like, let's say you find the book that says, you read the book and it's right. It's 100% correct on your life up to that point where you find the book. And then after that point, it tells you how you're going to live the rest of your life, and it's going to tell you how you die. But what if that is one of the permutations that's wrong? What if that's the permutation that it like gets one detail wrong and it just completely forks out and branches into this other life that you are not going to live? Do you trust this text that you found, or do you treat it as gospel? Just because you found the one permutation that like actually made sense about your life.
And that led up to that one point of finding it, then it branches off and completely different. And then, and then on top of that, if once you realize, oh, this one forked a different way.
Then what does the book mean?
Yeah.
Is it as meaningless as the books that just repeat the same three letters over and over and over again?
Exactly. Do they hold the same weight, the same value? What can we extract from that?
Right. And so in the short story, the protagonist relates that there's like the initial boom of like the seekers basically who go out and like they all hunt books that have meaning. And in the beginning, they're not even particularly trying to find the book of vindication or like the book that, has meaning to them personally. They're literally just trying to find books that make coherent sense from start to finish, right? Because you start to think about literally every single permutation of every single letter and every single line. Like it's just hard to find a book that makes sense from start to finish. Right?
Yeah.
So when these people, the librarians, start to hunt out these books, they quickly start to realize like, okay, it's just impossible for one librarian in one's lifetime to find a book that has meaning to them particularly, let alone find a book that makes sense from start to finish.
Yeah.
So because of that, then we swing back into like this like Depression era where the librarians realize there is no meaning to life because we'll never find books that make sense, and we'll never find the meaning of life because we'll just never find the book. And and so then, it's kind of like a dark period in history. Then some librarians start to like throw the books over the railing into the ventilation shaft because they're nihilistic. It becomes kind of anarchic because what is the meaning of life at that point?
Yeah.
And then things start to swing back into a sort of a happy medium where librarians, they realize that the chances of finding these books is astronomically low, but the fact that there is that chance of finding it keeps them going and makes them, have to stop these nihilistic anarchists who are just like burning books.
Yep.
And then at the very end, the protagonist basically relates that his discovery is that in reality, the library is not finite. That if you just went up the spiral staircase or down the spiral staircase or went endlessly right or endlessly left, and you found quote unquote the end of the library, where you found the last of every single permutation of these books, you would actually find the beginning of the library, and every single permutation would repeat again. And that is what he calls, quote unquote, the order of the library. That once you found the very last of the permutations, it would just begin again. All the permutations would begin again endlessly and cycling. And so in reality, his discovery at the very end of the short story is that the Library of Babel actually is infinite at the end.
Yeah.
Now that's just kind of like the twist ending, right? Like that kind of puts a neat bow on the plot. And so if you just read the short story on like a surface level, it's like a really neat short story with a cool twist ending at the end. But I think what Borges is actually getting at and what he's trying to say with the short story, obviously he's trying to say a lot. There's like so many different interpretations and meanings that you can get out of the short story. But to me, personally, what I took away from this short story is the fact that there were some nihilistic librarians out there who, when they realized the chances of finding the meaning of life were so astronomically low, that they started burning books. And then there was the answer to that, in that the librarians realized, like, yes, the chances of finding the meaning of life are astronomically low, but we can't just go into nihilism and we can't go into anarchy because there is that chance. I think that's ultimately what Borges was trying to say about the meaning of life. The meaning of life is the fact that the chances are astronomically low in finding meaning, but because of that small chance, you have to separate from being someone who is just completely nihilistic, completely anarchistic, and someone who just like gives up on life. And the chase and you going throughout your life chasing that small, astronomically low chance of finding the meaning of life is worth life, right? Like that is the meaning of life, which is like a really meta and hard thing to fathom. But ultimately, I think that that's what the librarian realized in him finding infinity and finding, quote unquote, the order of the library. He realized like the chase and the traveling and the reading of the books is ultimately the meaning of life, right?
Yes.
Like you may never find the actual concrete book that tells you from start to finish, this is, A, B, C, and D, the checklist of life. This is what actually life means. You may never, and most likely will never find that book. But it's the fact that you are out there gathering different books and hunting for those little nuggets of information and passing that down slowly and steadily to like future generations. That is what keeps humanity and civilization going. I think in a lot of ways, him saying that you will never find the meaning of life is actually by design by a divine creator. Because if you actually found that book, what is the point of life after that? Right?
Exactly.
Like if a book just tells you what the meaning of life is and just tells you how to live your life, then what is the point after that? What are you chasing and what are you striving for after that? There's no progress. There's no reason to continue as a civilization at that point. And so the chase is the point. The forward continuation of humanity to find the meaning of life that you will never find is the point, right? Like
Yes.
that is the why of humanity.
Yes.
And yeah, so that was my interpretation and what I like the big thing that I took away from the Library of Babel on just like first and second reading. I'm sure that I'll probably even take more, and there's so much that I missed. But what did you take away?
Man, you probably voiced what I could never have in 100 years. That was exactly, well, honestly, reading this, and I've read it a few times now throughout the years, and I'm always just like, what is this about? Like, it's so cool world building. He builds this like world with cultures and different dialects, and there's like mythology. There's the bookman who is like a librarian that found like this. He became like godlike because he found this book, and you have all the different stuff that's happening in the world. And for a long time, like that's just how I interpreted it. But you putting it like this, that really makes sense. And I'm happy we've done this because, as we spoke earlier, this is a big part of why we wanted to do Borges, because it illuminates stuff like this. And it makes so much sense that he would think that this is his like allegory or his metaphor for humanity and the meaning of life. And it's the chase, and it's just doing, and it's just doing your way of life, doing your culture. And the fact that you're in this realm for a finite period of time, that is the meaning of life itself.
Yes. I think ultimately what Borges was trying to say too is that the meaning of life literally is infinity. The meaning of life is continuing on and chasing that which is infinite, which means and implies that you will never catch it.
Exactly.
Which is like,
it's the paradox.
It's a paradoxical and such a heady concept, and it's really, really hard to like fathom. Right.
Yeah.
Like I remember reading the short story, and like my like brain was just like shifted in ways that it hadn't before. And I was like struggling to like get to that conclusion, which is, I think, in a soft conclusion at the end of the day, right? Like Borges isn't spelling this out. He didn't articulate this. This is just my interpretation of it. But I think it's such a masterful piece of literature that Borges was literally able to create that concept through this short story, right? Like he was, at the end of the day, the short story is about a librarian living in a universe comprised of hexagonal libraries, right? Like that is the short story. But in reality, like through this little 7-page short story, Borges is relating the meaning of life.
Exactly.
Like he's coloring what infinity is in 7 pages. It's just
exactly
fucking mind-blowing.
It's fucking mind-blowing.
Like if that alone doesn't tell you that Borges is the GOAT, I don't know what will. And I don't know who your GOAT is at that point. You know?
Well, oh man. Now if you relate, so in the story, there's so many constraints. It's hexagonal and there's only bookcases on these sides and there's only so many, pages and letters per page. And then to get real meta, you zoom out. Borges' constraint was he fit all of that in less than 10 pages.
Yeah.
And I think it's like 7 pages.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I was saying earlier that I don't think he was even capable of writing a novel, because he would say everything he wants to say in less than 100 pages.
He didn't waste any time.
He didn't need the novel format. He just straight up didn't need it. Yeah. And I don't know if you caught on to this either, but his world building also has it translates really well to like real world stuff. So for instance, the reason it's hexagons are actually found in nature. So beehives,
like fractal.
Yeah. If you look at the way beehives are constructed, they're actually all hexagons.
Oh,
and that's how they like keep their structure.
Oh.
Yeah. And so
that's interesting.
Yeah, right? Like hexagons are like a naturally occurring thing in the world.
In nature. Yeah.
And so that's why he made the library hexagonal. And then also he makes it very clear that the books are organic, which I thought that struck me, right?
Why?
So he says, I'll pull a quote from the short story. In order to grasp the distance that separates the human and the divine, one only has to compare these crude, trembling symbols, which my fallible hand scrawls on the cover of a book, with the organic letters inside, neat, delicate, deep black, and inimitably symmetrical. So basically, the letters that are on these books they're like typeface, right? They're like what it looks like in our world on a book. But what he's saying is like handwriting is human and typeface is the divine.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a really interesting thing, because something that we create, such as handwriting, that is what he describes as human. But if it's out in nature, that is what the divine is. And in the library, the infinite library in this universe, nature, quote unquote, is these books. And so these letters and these typeface really is nature. It's their version of what nature is. Of
nature.
And so I think that translates to how some of us view the world, right? Like some of us try to find meaning in nature. We try to look for symbols in the world. We all try to find, things like coincidences that happen to us in the world, when in reality, it's just like nature. It's just the world being the world.
All these astrology people, they're going to be so
triggered,
butthurt. They're going to be so triggered.
But yeah, it's almost the equivalent, right? Like it's us looking at the stars and thinking of them as like, it's the same hunt, right? Like it's us hunting for meaning.
Oh my gosh, man. I just thought the same idea. This sort of applies to like interplanetary existence and like trying to get to another planet. It almost runs along the same lines, doesn't it?
How so?
It's that same hunt for meaning. Like that's nature for us. And well, maybe I'm getting too deep ahead of
No,
myself.
no, no. Go, go, go. Keep
Maybe I
going.
jumped ahead of my skis. Well, I'm
Think
trying
through
to
this.
think. Yeah, I want to think through this.
But
you're
yeah,
saying
it's the same concept as like
it's like because they have this infinitesimal hope of finding the correct book, and so maybe that it's sort of similar to like the approach to being interplanetary that like Elon Musk and like all these other people have, or to going to the moon, or understanding the stars and putting a telescope out there. There's this hope, and this hope of maybe finding life. There's this hope
it's
of
the
being.
equivalent of going up the spiral staircase, and
It's the equivalent of going up,
yeah,
or left, or right, or
right,
down. It's
right.
the same
I
travel.
I equate it to like the early civilizations who took the movements of the sun and like compared them to their divinity, their gods and things like that. When in reality, we're just a planet doing laps around the sun, right? Like we just gained more knowledge. But it's that same equivalent thing, right? Like they are looking to their nature, to their sun, which is letters in a book, and they're trying to find meaning behind those things.
Yeah.
When in reality, I think what the protagonist comes to is that like it's not that it's meaningless, because it's not. It's just we are so infinitely small in this universe that we will never gather the meaning in the library.
Yes.
But that is the point of it.
But nonetheless, that little sliver, tiny percent of hope is the meaning.
Yes. And that is what necessitates us to continue moving forward as a civilization, in spite of the fact that we will never find that meaning.
Yep.
It's crazy. Yeah. It's crazy.
I remember you texting me being like, my mind will never recover.
Even talking about it now, like it's a hard thing to talk about because it's so paradoxical. It's so hard to articulate what Borges is relaying in this short story. It makes me wonder, like, how did he think of this in his head? Not how did he think of the story in his head. I think the story itself is just like a really clever vehicle to relate what he's trying to say. I wonder how he thought of what he was trying to say in his head.
Yeah,
and,
like how
and
did
does he agree with me? I wonder if that actually is what he was trying to say.
Yeah, if that's even what he was trying to say, or if he was just doing a really unique world building exercise in a world that would make sense to him. It's all books, it's all bookcases, and for him being the author's author, the writer's writer, that's the world he would be in.
Right.
That's like his universe. But I don't know, man. This is one of the things we'll never know. Was this something where he sort of came to this point from just him like thinking and pondering, was like, I'm going to pin this down. I'm going to put this into a story and try and relay it and then embed all of these things into it. And then I'm also going to build the world around it and like this culture, and it's going to explain it perfectly this way. I don't know. I also want to know if he like bounced ideas off people, or if this was a singularity thing. Like writing for him was just like singular.
Yeah,
always in his mind.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question though, because who do you bounce it off? You know, like you need someone to be able to match the level of intellect and spirituality and things like that with Borges.
Open-mindedness.
Yeah, because he's dealing with such grand themes, and so you need someone who's willing to get to that level with him and not just think of like, oh, this story doesn't work mechanically or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Just on a functional writing level.
Right.
Like, no, come play with me up here in the stars.
Exactly.
Let's think about the meaning of life.
Exactly.
I don't know, man. There's probably some like Borges experts out there that would know, but
Yeah. Well, regardless of that, though, even if a Borges expert listens to this episode and they're like, "Oh my god, these fucking jokesters,
idiots
didn't get 1% of this short story," I'm honestly okay with that because I do think that Borges is a thing that you come back to and that you dig and gather even more from on subsequent readings. And
on top of that, this is just bros book club, man.
Exactly.
Don't get so mad at us.
Exactly. And what I was trying to get at is that, like, I want this to be as accessible as I can be.
Yeah.
Because like I was, as we introduced this episode, like that's what I want this episode and this podcast to be. I want this to be like a bridge and an entryway into people like Borges. And so while it is really like highbrow, high concept things that we're talking about and really difficult things to articulate, I like I was saying before, I think it's something to be experienced. Even us talking about this and our interpretations and going full spoilers, despite everything we've said, the reason it's so hard to talk about is because you have to experience it. You have to read it yourself and gather your own meaning and your own interpretation of the text, because in those 7 pages lies the treasure.
Seriously.
And you may pick up a gold coin, but someone else might pick up a doubloon, a Spanish piece of 8, like,
it's a good way to put it.
Yeah. It's just what you take away from it is going to be not totally different from me, but it might be different in a very like nuanced way.
Yeah. I think that's just the way he wanted to write too. Just open for interpretation, allegorical, metaphorical, everything. And that's why Borges is timeless.
Yes.
I think
he's
it's
infinite.
He's Borges is infinite, man.
He's the library. What if he wrote this short story to be like, this is as clear as day as I can make it to say that this is my mind. This is what living in my mind is like.
This is living in my mind.
Yeah.
It's like bookcases on bookcases for infinity.
Yes.
And most of it's nonsense. But every once in a while,
there's one permutation out there.
That makes a lot of sense.
Holy shit.
But most of the time, it's just bullshit.
Holy shit. I actually really like that interpretation.
Yeah. Maybe that's actually it.
Yeah. Because that, oh my God. That's kind of like human consciousness.
Yeah.
And like the construction of the mind. Like there's so many endless permutations of what makes up a person. There's so many endless permutations of what makes personality and makes you. It's like an infinite library, but we gather meaning in all those permutations.
And there's so many different ways it could have gone.
Right. See, there you go. That's just like right there.
It's a good one.
Totally different interpretation of the text.
Library of Babel. Such a good one.
Yeah. Okay.
Do we want to dive into this, or do we want to do a follow-up episode? And
what are we at time-wise?
We're over an hour and a half, I think.
Holy shit.
It was a good episode, man.
Yeah.
I mean, really, the intro and talking about Borges.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm let's end it. Let's do some teasers on other short stories.
Tease.
So another short story that I want to get to possibly in another episode is Funes His Memorias. And it's another like really short story, and it's about a man who literally remembers everything. He is someone who has he has perfect recall. But it's not like something that you would see in the movies where he can just recall everything at his command. It's actually outside of his control. So for instance, if I had a perfect recall like he does in this short story, every time that I looked at my keyboard, I would have flashbacks to every single time that I have looked at this keyboard and typed on this keyboard. Now you think about that, and I have looked at this keyboard and typed on this keyboard a lot.
A lot of times.
Like many, many hours. And so to have that flashback come back to me would be like debilitating for at least for a few moments.
This is also Borges' mind.
Yeah. And so anyway, yeah, not to already get super deep into another short story, but yeah, that's another short story that Borges wrote that I would like to dive into. And you're a fan. Why don't you talk a couple of your short stories that you want to go into?
One in particular that I think we're going to do, this is a nice little teaser, is one of the first short stories I read by Borges was The Shape of the Sword. And it's not super meta, it's not super deep, anything like that. It's just really a story about a guy with a big scar across his face. And how did that happen? And the way he tells the story is sort of what's cool about the story. So I think we do a little follow-up episode, do Funis, do Shape of the Sword.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I'm down for that. Yeah. Would you say that The Shape of the Sword is a good intro to Borges? Or do you think people should just go straight into Library or Funis, his Memorias?
Depends on how you want to look at it. I think Shape of the Sword is more forgiving on your brain.
I agree.
You can really, I mean, it's a simple story in essence. I mean, there's some bigger themes and stuff in it that we'll talk about in the next episode or whatever, but you can totally go into it unimposed and come out of it alive without your brain hurting. And it's got a nice classic Borges twist. That's one of the reasons it was one of the first ones I read, and it sort of gave me momentum to get into them. And then I read some of the denser ones, and I was like, "Ooh, Papa's not ready for this one yet."
Yeah, The Shape of the Sword is only like 3 pages long.
Yeah.
So I think, that would be a good little intro into Borges. But at the same time, I would warn that it's not.
It's still Borges.
It's Borges. It's a great story to just read at the surface level. You will just get like a quick little 3-page story and just be like, oh wow, that was a good little twist ending.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's literally like you said, it's just a dude who has a giant scar, and the narrator of the story is like, how'd you get that scar? And that's the whole story. That's literally the story. It's just a guy talking about this, how he got a scar.
Yeah.
It's a good little intro into Borges, but it will not prepare you for some of like the more masterworks of him.
Do you think Funis would?
I don't know. I think Funis is kind of like on a similar level as Library, in that if you read Funis and you enjoy Funis, you should obviously just go read Library.
Yeah.
But is it a good intro? I don't know. Borges, it really is one of those authors that you just need to prepare to have your mind altered. You cannot go softly into Borges.
Before Borges, after Borges.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
That's what this episode should be called.
So anyway, if we could succinctly, in 3 words or less, what is your opinion on Borges?
Oh.
My 3 words or less is go read Borges.
Go read Borges.
If I could describe this episode and what I want this episode to be in 3 words or less, it's go read Borges.
That's spot on.
Ultimately what we're trying to say. Whether all bros out there, whether you like sci-fi, fantasy, literary stuff, no matter what you read, if you know the English language, you owe it to yourself to read someone like Borges.
Spot on. And hey, bro, check this out. They're not that long.
Yes, exactly.
Think about that. You're all of our short attention spans now.
Yeah,
You only need 3 pages of reading,
exactly.
and your mind will be blown.
And you will be able to participate intellectually with Ryan All Caps and Ernie and the Bros Book Club.
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally agree. You don't have to commit all this time to these huge, massive tomes in order to engage with this podcast or engage in any sort of discussion or discourse about Borges. Like Library of Babel is literally 7 pages. You can get that done even if you're very slow, and like I read Library very slow, and it took me like 40 or 45 minutes because I did like
under an hour.
The whole paragraphs. I think I reread like one whole page, and so like you can just take your time with it, but bam, like you can get it done in one sitting.
Yes, you can. Under an hour, really.
For sure.
And then I can't remember, so many times I've been like, my favorite author is Borges. People are like, oh, never heard of him. That's great.
Boom. Now you're
more people.
A well-read bro.
Exactly.
Now you're a posh bro.
A posh bro.
Exactly.
Talk to me about Borges. It's not Borges. Borges.
Now you can look at people who say Borges and be
I do.
It's Borges.
I do.
There's I think you introduced me to this YouTube channel, Better Than Food. Was it you?
No, it wasn't me.
Oh, okay. There's this YouTuber called Better Than Food. He's a booktuber. I think he would fit in with us. He seems like a bro.
Okay.
But he mostly reads like literature, like more literary works and stuff like that. But he has a video on Borges, and his basically his rating of Borges is go steal him. If you because he had a friend borrow a Borges copy from him and they stole it, and he's like, look, go borrow it, quote unquote, from your friend and steal it, because if there's one author or one book that you steal from your friend, it's Borges. Because you will be happy and your friend won't mind because they'll understand.
Yeah.
And I totally agree. I'm like, if someone stole my copy of Borges, I'd be like, I'm just going to get another one. Like, good for them. Yeah. I'm glad that they took that copy.
Exactly. Now they get it.
Yeah.
That's why they're keeping it.
So anyway, let's get to our rating. So on Bros Book Club, we do a unique rating system in lieu of a traditional 5-star or 10-star or something. We think of 5 bros in our life, and we think, how many bros out of 5 would I recommend this book to? And Borges unequivocally is going to be a 5 bro rating for me. I 5 bros out of 5. I want all 5 of my bros to read Borges. Selfishly, because I want to talk Borges with all of them, but selflessly because I think we all can take something from Borges. We can all learn the meaning of life from Borges.
Yeah, 5 out of 5 bros. I'm telling every bro about my bro, Borges.
And then his bro is going to tell 5 of his bros. And then that bro is going to tell 5 of his bros. And then we're going to have the library of Brobel.
Borges is my bro. I want that as a sticker.
Brohes.
Brohes. Oh my God.
All right.
Yes.
Thanks for tuning in, bros. This was an awesome episode. We're definitely going to do more Borges in the future. And maybe we'll do some more posh reading with other posh authors. Maybe I can convince Ryan to read Gene Wolfe.
That's going to take some convincing, my friend. No, I'm joking. The way you talk about him.
The way Gene Wolfe talks about Borges. That's the pitch alone.
That's true. Actually, yeah. Yeah. I don't know anything about Gene Wolfe.
Gene Wolfe has short stories, so we can just do short stories with Gene Wolfe too.
I like short stories.
Yeah, they're so easy.
Yeah, man. I can really get into them.
Yeah. That's another thing, bros. Don't just read novels. Read short stories.
Read short stories.
Yeah.
But nothing's going to top Borges. In 7 pages, he'll blow your mind.
Yeah. He is the pinnacle of
So-
short stories.
Understand that.
Yeah. All right, bros. This has been Nerdy Ernie and Ryan All Caps. Please smash that like button. Subscribe. And we'll see you in the infinite library of Brobel.
Bye, bros.
Bye, bros.